believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome. My non-university unstudents, welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. When I was a wee lad of 12 years old, my dad and stepmom decided to take me, my two brothers, two stepbrothers, and our sister to Disneyland. Now, we lived in Central Oregon, so the trip involved a 15-hour one-way car ride south. All of us crammed into a station wagon. Two or three of us rode way in the back, facing backwards. But man, oh man, the excitement that Disney generated. I mean, we had regularly watched The Wonderful World of Disney on Sunday nights. We frequented Disney movies in the local theater on Saturday afternoons, Saturday matinees, and I remember films like Swiss Family Robinson, Peter Pan, Old Yeller, Mary Poppins. Disney movies were magical. They were events to experience and relish. Disney, God bless Walt Disney, Disney had figured out how to both capture and shape our country's collective imagination. Disney movies were, even for my conservative rural church, safe for our viewing pleasure. But something happened along the mouse-trodden trail. Disney became enlightened. No, more accurately, Disney Studios got woke. And from their box office revenue numbers, their influence is no less powerful today than when I was a kid. Now, whereas 50 years ago Disney was producing movies with subtle Christian themes, today Disney Studio is producing movies with not so subtle, frankly, with overtly anti-Christian themes. How did this happen? More importantly, why does it matter? Why does it matter? You see, Christian parents and pastors have, for 60 years, warned their kids and parishioners of the influence of movies, and so they cautioned us against seeing a movie where someone said damn or where a woman's breast was exposed, and I'm not making light of that concern, but we did that, or they did that, all the while ignoring the power of story. The power of story is far more abiding, lasts much longer than our exposure to a swear word or a human body part. But we Christians, we ignore the power of story. And we fail to realize that the movie industry has taken a significant portion of the Christ-centered worldview and turned it positively away from Christ, away from His truth and His beauty and His goals for creation. And that's the power of story. In this careful interview with author Samuel Lively, we explore together how story, and particularly Disney stories, take Christian themes, play upon them, rework them, morph them, and decidedly bend them away from a God-centered vision for reality. So sit back and relax and learn as I did throughout this interview of how the mouse snuck in, Disney and Christian culture. Hey, thanks a lot for being willing to let me do this with you.
Oh, hey, I appreciate any chance to get to talk about the book, guy.
Sure. I really enjoyed your book. I think it's very timely.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I tried to push it out right when Disney Plus launched because I figured a lot of people would be experiencing not just the new releases, but really their entire catalog.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was smart. And I'm hoping people are reading books and not just watching TV during this whole quarantine time.
Well, I know my book is the rare twofer, right? You get to read about what you're about to stream. So.
Yeah. So I'm just going to ask you these questions,
Sure.
and I'm happy to have a free-flowing conversation. Because, like I say, I read your book and I thought, man, this is so necessary. So I want to welcome you, Samuel. Samuel Lively is the author of The Trojan Mouse. and it's a book about what's going on with Disney movie making and the power of story and the power on culture. And Samuel, thanks for being willing for the interview today.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm curious, did you grow up on Disney, or why did you choose to write kind of a historical overview of Disney pictures?
Yeah, well, I mean, almost all of us grew up on Disney in America. It's the closest thing to the most popular of American popular culture in terms of hours watched, in terms of cultural impact. So I'm a child of Disney, just like anybody else who's been born since 1935, really.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, it's I chose it because I'd been long aware of the dual nature of the company. First, as a very what I call loyalist institution, very conservative, very Christian friendly institution, and then its pretty rapid transformation into the antithesis of a
yeah,
loyalist Christian conservative institution, what I call a revolutionary cultural organ. And so I thought it made a great case study for what the culture war means from an entertainment perspective, and how a company can go from promoting one worldview to its complete antithesis in a very short period of time. And then through that, have a massive impact on all the loyal consumers of that brand. And Disney has some of the most loyal consumers of all time.
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, as a kid, me and my brothers and my sister, we grew up watching there was a Disney show on Sunday evenings, and we would go to the theater to see Disney cartoon movies on Saturday matinees. Later,
Hmm.
when we had kids, my wife and I, with the help of some of her family, we got annual Disneyland passes. And I
Hmm.
remember when Disneyland started to not just say welcome homosexuals, but sort of set up the park or reserve the park for homosexual events. And I thought, well, are they just capitulating? At the time, I just thought, well, the culture is swinging. Maybe they're just capitulating. But after I read your book, I thought, actually, I think they were getting on that train.
Yes, definitely. That happened in the early 90s, right after Michael Eisner took over. And that was one of the areas where Disney was on the forefront of the shift towards very explicit anti or counter Christian culture in Hollywood. There had been a lot of movies. Disney was not the first, certainly, on the to shift to a very revolutionary, progressive worldview, but they were one of the first to do so in a way that I think affected the entire American mainstream. It's one thing to have R-rated movies that push a certain worldview. It's a completely different thing to have G-rated, family-friendly movies that reach multiple generations over a long period of time. To have those movies and to have the extension of those movies like Disneyland to start to shift that culture. And yeah, that was one of the first warning signs in the early 90s that there was a new sheriff in town, was their changing position on things um, like gay pride parades, and they were one of the first to extend marital benefits to gay couples, sort of like canaries in the coal
Yeah.
mine for what was happening from a worldview perspective at the company.
Yeah. And as I was reading through, when I was reading through your book, I thought, well, Samuel's gonna say, well, here's the movie that caused the switch to flip, but really it had more to do with management or control, CEOs, those pulling the top levers of power, than it
Hmm.
was any one movie that it's not like they made a movie that made $1 billion and then they went, oh wow, we can make a killing doing this. This was a decided ideological shift.
Right. Well, I mean, if you think, the old expression is politics is downstream of culture, but culture itself is downstream from artists and creators and the people who fund those artists and creators. So when you have a major shift in the people who are making creative decisions, it's going to impact the culture more so. I mean, again, we have this idea that popular culture is completely responsive to the will of the people, but
Right.
it isn't. It really it has to submit certain things to popular taste, but it gets to choose the narratives that are going to be presented. And because there are only so many major studios out there, there's a enormous power to shift culture from those major Hollywood stations. Because when you're one of two to three major family oriented filmmakers, that means you're going to be creating a very significant percentage of what American and really what now global children are going to be consuming. So it's definitely not something that was just one big hit movie that shifted something. It was instead a change in the people, a change in the values of the people in charge that then trickled downstream into the movies that were produced. And then that in turn has trickled downstream into mainstream values now moving significantly from where they were a generation or two generations ago.
Well, I can tell you as a college professor, I taught adjunct for 10 years and full time for 15 years. I
Mhm.
saw the gradual shift in the classroom from students when I started. Most the students had a Christian background, came in, and they were fairly evangelical and conservative. And I
Mhm.
watched over 25 years as that moved. The dial moved, the thermometer moved across the spectrum. And by the time I was done, I had evangelical kids sitting in my classroom asking, like, what's your problem with homosexual marriage? What does God care as long as people love one another? And I think people don't realize that one reason, significant reason, that kids came to embrace that is through the power of a company like Disney.
Right. And again, it's a the way I like to make people think is that they people tend to be locked into their own individual perspective, and they don't realize the power that other people have in shaping that perspective. And one thing that entertainment does is, and again, while we're quite unaware of that impact, if we're just an escapist consumer, who's not considering what's actually happening when we consume entertainment. But when you sit down in a theater or at home in front of the TV, what you're doing is you are making a contract with the storyteller. You are going to suspend your disbelief. In return, they're going to elevate you, take you out of your limited perspective, and give you a much more thrilling, almost a God level perspective on the world. Now, yes,
Wow.
it's a fictional world, but it's going to be consumed by you as if it's real. That's the whole thrill. The thrill is that you are leaving on this little magic carpet, right?
Yeah.
To experience the world from a God level perspective, which means all the boring stuff is going to be cut out. You're going to be able to zoom from all the most meaningful parts of somebody's life, and you're going to see what acts are rewarded, what acts are punished, what true heroism is, what true villainy is. And so that power, I mean, if you can imagine being able to do that for real, right? If you were able to
Yeah.
be like Job and go into the whirlwind and have God show you the foundations of the earth, it was a completely life altering experience for Job. And what we do in entertainment is we do a sort of a fraction of that, a simulation of that. And it has collectively a similar power to completely change someone's perspective. So those students who are coming in with fundamental shifts in worldview, that a lot of that I believe was obtained because they were going with these storytellers into these heavenly perspectives on the way life worked.
Yeah.
But the God in that scenario, the God in the whirlwind in that scenario was someone who was actually hostile to a Christian worldview and was actually teaching them to view life from a completely different perspective,
Yes.
one of hedonism, right? One of pleasure seeking, one of grievance, of fostering in terms of looking who wronged you, who
Right.
is exerting authority over you, who is preventing you from living your best life, the way you want to. So all those that mentality, I think, has been fed, especially by Disney. And Disney in the early '90s was basically one big propaganda tour for decoupling from traditional authority structures and instead embracing the teenage heart as the ultimate moral compass. And then that teenage heart could then be shifted even further towards, again, grievance oriented prophets
Yeah.
who are going to tell that teenage heart, look, your fathers are the problem. They're the oppressors here. And what you need to actually do is you need to shift your sympathies away from your own tradition and towards all of these various outsider groups who have been oppressed or wronged by traditional authority figures. And so as a result, the kids who have grown up on a steady diet of that kind of worldview programming, they're naturally they're going to default to taking the side of the supposed outsider, right?
Yeah.
So whenever you're put in a position of which is going to prevail, the traditional morality or the revolutionary new hedonistic based morality, their heart is going to be primed, even if their head has been primed up, to do the other. They're
Right.
going to naturally gravitate emotionally to the position that rewards the outsider.
And and all of that's so true. And I'm just thinking with you, it's not as simple as saying, well, these kids have watched hundreds or thousands of hours of movies so that they've been programmed. It's that the movie comes with an emotional punch or an emotional rope that the kids hang on to or grasp onto, that all the while they're swinging on that rope, it's changing their imagination. It's subtly shifting their worldview.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you look at the way that we build worldview, there's two ways. There's exposition of people in authority, right? People explaining the way the world works, and then there's experience. And experience is rightly considered the more powerful. It's not that exposition doesn't have a very vital role, but experience can be very powerful. And because entertainment simulates experience, it can ultimately override a lot of what you're taught. And so the when you look at any sort of moral quandary, a lot of people think they're dealing with it purely intellectually, but really a lot of times what's at work is your emotional priming is leading you to determine who's the hero, who's the villain, what the causes and consequences are of the situation. You're not using facts and theories and systematic theologies to
Right.
break that down. You're using narratives. You're using this person's good, this person's bad. And the way that we get those narratives is through consuming narratives. You don't usually translate what you're taught in forms of rules and regulations into narrative. You usually go from narrative to narrative, which is why
Mhm.
myths have always been so key in all cultures. We need a repository of stories, both factual and fictional, that can guide our brains, right? They can guide our brains to be able to process
Yeah.
oral information in ways that our hearts can understand. And
Well, I
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I loved your opening chapter of the book because it's kind of like the first salvo, the first shot, and you're framing worldview for us. And again, I've taught on worldview for a long time. I love reading books about worldview and how worldview is shaped, but you were setting that up, and I thought this is so good because he's not just going to narrate a long chronology of Disney movies and Disney executives. He's
Mhm.
also you are also intentionally framing your study in light of worldview and the effect of worldview and how worldview plays upon us.
Mhm.
I thought that was genius.
Well, thank you. But yeah, that's it, if you don't understand the power of storytelling, it's going to be very difficult to guard your worldview. I mean, I know a lot of Christian parents, especially, have have invested a lot of time and resources in training their children so that they don't depart from the way in which they were raised.
Yeah.
But it's the blind spot I saw growing up, and I've seen in Christian literature, is that again, culturally, in American Christian culture, is heavily didactic. Very much.
Yeah.
We go to church, we sit down in the pews, we listen to someone teach us. And there, again, I don't mean to to devalue that. It is
No,
hugely
no.
important, but we don't culturally we don't really have a significant um, presence in narrative storytelling. The Bible is a huge repository of brilliant narrative, but as a culture, in terms of the way that we teach our children, we tend to be pretty reliant on heavily didactic forms, and we were blessed in America to have a very sort of default Christian media um, for a long period of time. Like if you go back to between 1949 and 1960, if you look at the movies that were like the equivalent of the Marvel movies today, you're seeing movies like Ben Hur, like Quo Vadis, like the Ten Commandments, movies that were explicitly Christian,
Yeah.
hugely popular, and again, so there was uh, a relaxation, I think, that Christian culture in America had because we were the default, right? We were the background culture. And so when our entertainment culture fell in the hands of people who did not like Christianity and wanted to overthrow a lot of its moral precepts, we were very much unprepared. And there wasn't really anything native to the church or to the family that was able to protect against the changes that was going to bring. And and so as a result, we've continued to double down on on again the sort of apologetics and the
Yeah.
intellectual side,
Yeah.
and we've sort of kept this blind spot for the Trojan mouse to come through, which is as long as it wasn't have sex or
Yeah.
violence or open blasphemy, I mean, people were willing to just let their kids watch uncritically
Yeah.
stuff that was actually, I think, setting up a rivalry with the stories of the Bible and the stories of Christian heritage for primacy in the hearts of not just their kids but themselves as well. I mean, a lot of adults have been shifted from their
Oh.
moral bases to through consumption of entertainment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking again because our kids are adults now, but while we were parents, we
Mhm.
had access to a couple websites that would help review movies for Christian parents, right? And
Mhm.
on those websites, it would have the movie and who's acting, the gist of the story, but then it would say how many breasts were exposed, or how many swear words there were,
Right,
or right, how many acts of brutal violence, that and all that's legit, but then
right,
it wouldn't say anything about the story and the effect of the story and what the philosophy of the story was to make you embrace da da da, or the
exactly.
philosophy of the story was to make you reject that former Christian, traditional Judeo-Christian component, and to put that on the back shelf. And
Mhm.
so, and I'm stealing from you here, but so you have parents now who again are worried about seeing body parts, but who don't care that their children's entire philosophical
Yeah,
value structured worldview has been reshaped by a movie about two girls playing in the snow.
right, exactly. And there's a very good book on that by a guy named Brian Godawa, who wrote. It's called Hollywood Worldviews. I think he wrote it in the late '90s or early 2000s, where he really takes that particular issue head on. The idea of soup, uh, external moral content versus internal moral content, um, and how a being so guarded to the one and open to the other is enormously dangerous for
Yeah.
Christian communities.
So you're enough of a philosopher that I'm going to ask you this question, and it's a bit off of Disney per se, but what is it about story that's so powerful on the human imagination? Why are we so wired to story?
Well, I mean, as a Christian, I believe it's the image of God. I mean, we are in created in the image of a creator who sees things in terms of beginning, middle, and end. And so, at our most fundamental level, we are best able of understanding things from that creation level perspective. And so, the most primitive narrative, the most primitive language of our heart is narrative.
Mm,
So if you want to be able to communicate heart to heart, then you really need to be able to structure it in narrative. And it's no accident that the most common and most influential, most long lasting cultural artifacts are narratives, right? We can
yeah.
still enjoy things like the Iliad and the Odyssey. We can still enjoy Shakespeare, even with massive cultural and language changes, because they are at their core the same human language,
Hmm.
they fill the same needs. And Aristotle, um, in Poetics, his sort of deep dive into the structure of drama, um, identified a lot of things that we can still see today in terms of the core cultural function that narrative and entertainment provide for human beings. We need to be able to get above the daily toil and to
Mm,
be able to get back to that God level perspective of life, to be able to see our beginnings, our middle, our ends, to be able to see good versus evil, to be able to see the the manifestation of the order and the rules, the moral rules that govern our universe. And you can't do that if you're constantly stuck just in the day-to-day grind. You need to have that escape. Again, escape is kind of a misnomer though, because it's not like we're escaping from reality. We're actually escaping from the distraction of having to fight and grind out our living, so we can actually see from a much more authoritative perspective, which is what the storyteller is promising. So that's why storytelling is so huge. It
so
is, yeah,
story's not an escape like, okay, I'm going to turn my brain off now and go to fantasy land. So much the way that human beings are wired, story is actually a means by which we are processing reality ourselves.
indeed. It is the fundamental way that I believe that our heart processes reality. And when you think about it, the way you store your own memories and the way our brains sort of recombine and process our memories and dreams, they always form narratives. They always have beginnings and
Mm,
ends. They always have sort of an emotional coding that that we that provides the sort of the coloring of that memory, and whether it's a positive or a negative one. And so yeah, it's just wired. It's hardwired into us to think in terms of narrative. So it's that makes it natural then, if you want to communicate not to the mind but to the heart, that you're going to structure your idea in a narrative, and you're going to have that idea shown by making choices in the narrative, just like God would make in creating the universe, right? Setting
hmm.
certain things off limits, putting certain consequences on certain actions, raising up some people, bringing down others. And when that narrative is consumed, all those ideas, all those teachings embedded in the causes and consequences in that world are going to be communicated to the human heart. And so if you believe it, if that has the moral resonance of truth, right, to you when you consume that story, you're going to basically going to be downloading that worldview. And if it's powerful enough, and especially if you keep on consuming that same kind of narrative over and over again, I believe it will override the ones that
Yeah.
you're taught more didactically.
Yeah, well, again, if Barna groups and others in their demographic studies that they are constantly publishing are any indication, you're spot on. We have Christian generations who are coming up through their adolescence into adulthood whose Christian framework is very thin at best. And it makes me wonder because we're thinking kind of missionally here for a minute, Samuel, and I'm
Mhm.
talking again with Samuel Lively, the author of The Trojan Mouse. It's a book on how Disney is intentionally shaping and reshaping culture, but thinking missionally with you, because
Mhm.
clearly you're not, this isn't just a historical study, it's kind of like a siren call. Hey folks, pay attention.
Right.
Thinking missionally with you, then does the church need to get back to story? I mean, I myself am a didactic thinker.
Mhm.
um, I taught didactically, though I tried to do goofy little things to hold people's attention. But it just makes me wonder if maybe we should be spending more time as church, at least, of just reading those stories and letting the
Right.
power of those stories wash over people, and maybe not need a whole ton of commentary.
We'll get to Samuel's answer to that question, but first, thanks, you guys. Thanks for your partnership, your Facebook shares. Thanks for your prayers for God's blessings on the unshow. Would you do me one more favor? Would you go to iTunes or YouTube and rate the show? Those ratings help us build traction, help us make a wider footprint, help us move forward. And your rating doesn't have to be long. You could simply write, "Ed helps me think critically about my Christian faith." It's that simple. And again, my sincere thanks for your support of the show.
Well, and here is the great thing though. It on the one hand, it's very difficult to create the capacity for compelling entertainment. The the limits. What is the word? The economic word? The high barrier to entry. You have very high barriers to entry in terms of creating compelling entertainment. Most of the really powerful movies and shows today are created at costs over $100 million.
Okay.
So it's very difficult for especially evangelicals who are very um, dispersed in terms of their resources to be able to compete with that. But here's the good thing: the didactic and the entertainment cultures can combine in that there is a lot of entertainment that's already been produced that is quite um, well aligned with Christian worldview. So that can be consumed. You just have to be a
Mhm.
good critical consumer and find it. And then also, you can critically consume negative, hostile narratives and have that be a strengthening component. And the key is to be able to watch and consume entertainment from a antagonistic position. So
Right.
that's where your didactic training can come in, where you going in and you are following the storyteller on that journey, right? That elevation to be able to see that world and to be able to see what that storyteller is doing. But instead of suspending disbelief totally, instead forcing that storyteller to justify
Yep.
those moral leaps that they make in the story. And so that's one thing that my parents were able to do with me when I was very young, to be able to watch some of those Disney movies and other movies with the perspective of skepticism, right? Enjoying the ride,
Yeah.
not trusting the storyteller with your heart.
Yeah.
So so I think one thing that churches can do right away is, instead of trying to create entertainment, although that's a very worthy goal and something that there's another route towards, uh, but to consume entertainment as a body, and that's one thing that I think is we don't do very well right now.
Yeah.
When the church goes to see movies, they tend to see movies that are curated just for evangelical niches, right? So we have our own sort of cottage industry of Christian movies, and that is usually what the church tackles. But I think their services are
Yeah.
much the church's ability to filter and shepherd the hearts of the flock is much more needed in movies where there's some hostility, some antagonism.
Yeah,
So
that's good.
doing little like a weekly, like a movie night.
Yep.
I know that's difficult now with with all the quarantines, but the having a situation where you can watch something as a group and have the shepherds, right, the sheepdogs,
Yeah.
able to point out some of the manipulation that's going on, be
Yeah.
able to frame discussions around it, so that that emotional activation happens. But instead of just allowing it to go directly coded into the heart, challenging it before it gets downloaded. And I think that the results that can actually be strengthened, a very strengthened, um, emotionally informed um, approach to entertainment.
Yeah, and I think I
It
love
worked
that
really well
idea,
for me growing up.
and I think it would be a way to build community too, as families coming together as church to watch movies. My
Mhm.
wife and I hosted movie night parties for all my years of teaching, and it would be so fascinating to walk the students through what just happened to them. The one that famously stands out in my mind was Million Dollar Baby
Mhm.
with Clint Eastwood and Hilary Swank. This story about a boxing manager and a female fighter, and it's a beautifully told tale that
Right.
has a conclusion that so violates a Christian worldview.
Mhm.
And I remember we did it a couple times because it's such a powerful story that at the end I'd say, okay, before we discuss the movie, how many would raise your hand and say you would do what the boxer's manager did? How many of you
Right.
would do what Clint Eastwood did? And like every out of 15 students, 13 would raise their hand.
Right.
And then I'd say, okay, now thinking back to our Christian worldview, how many of you think what he did squares with a Christian worldview? Well, no one would raise their hand.
Right.
And then they would all smile because they realized they just got played and worked by the movie to adopt a position that they wouldn't have without watching that movie.
That is a fantastic example of critical consumption. And again, you have to think of it almost like the way the brain codes memory. We don't just have like this stockpile, a library stockpile of memories. Memory is an active living process. So it's the same thing when we watch a movie. When you're watching a movie, it's not passive downloading. It's a interplay between your heart and mind and the storyteller. So if you're able to introduce some agency, some of your own um, resistance um, and pushback,
Yeah.
and it can make the experience so much more fulfilling. The movie Ratatouille, one of Pixar movies,
Hmm.
it has a good example of that in terms of the critic, right? The critic who's who's basically desperate to have some sort of food wow him. So as a result, he's challenging every taste. He's challenging every decision of the chef, and as a result, that gives him an even higher level of appreciation and pleasure out of the experience. So I think for Christians, we can actually enhance the pleasure of consumption sometimes by taking that critically consumptive view and and viewing it as a dialogue with the storyteller, not
Yeah.
just a passive. I'm going to let him or her take me to wherever they want to go.
Yeah, that's good. Critical consumption. And so between my being a dad, because I remember we watched Lion King with our kids, we named our cat Simba, right? Between the naming of the cat Simba and now my kids starting to have their own kids, I
Right.
haven't watched many cartoon movies.
Okay.
I'm an old stodgy intellectual. I want the movie to be openly, resolutely philosophical. Cartoons just haven't been interesting to me. Well, 2 months ago, I took my granddaughter to see Frozen 2.
Oh wow.
And I sat there, I was totally gobsmacked at the sermon that was being preached at my little 4-year-old granddaughter. Because that movie from beginning to end was one really loud, beautiful, clever, winsome,
Hmm.
enjoyable sermon.
Right.
And Disney's doing that on purpose.
Yeah, and Frozen Two's I think going to be a wake up call for a lot of people who haven't taken this seriously, because especially people who have at least a little background in worldview and apologetics, it's going to be pretty clear what they're doing in Frozen 2. And it's a full-fledged, all hands on deck attempt to subvert and replace Christian norms
Yeah.
and American cultural norms, and replace them with a very aggressively feminist, pagan,
Yeah.
matriarchal view of looking at the world. I mean, if you look at Elsa's, I mean, and it takes the worst part about it is that it takes a Christian frame, right? The Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale
Sensibility.
that
Yeah.
is the inspiration for the Frozen universe is a, I mean, it's very Baroque, but it's fundamentally based on Christian presuppositions.
Yeah.
And so it took that world, it strip mined it for the most visually and narratively appealing elements so that little girls in particular would love it. And then it left behind all that Christian heritage and instead infused it with the entire what's called the woke platform,
Yeah.
basically. So the Elsa character in particular, it's with the still small voice, right? They even take like the Christian um, framing of a Christian theological concept, and they turn that still small voice instead of a beckoning voice to the Christian sense of divine, it becomes instead a weird pagan slash um, nihilist take in which the inner voice is actually you,
Yeah.
the goddess inside, and then it turns that even into a literal incarnation where she really becomes a goddess. She
Yeah.
becomes the saving force for the entire civilization. It is only her own intervention, her own apotheosis to the divine that allows her to save the people. And then you flip that to the Anna character. Her whole moral journey is one to discover that the patriarch, right, her grandfather, is the ultimate evil.
Yeah.
It's a colonial imperialist oppressor class who is forcing his worldview on these pagan indigenous spiritual
Beautiful,
people.
beautiful pagan, noble, indigenous,
And
right?
that the proper response that she then has is to actually destroy her own city in sort of like a biblical flood scenario. So
Yeah.
it's like a doomsday cult. It's like a pagan doomsday cult that is
Yeah.
then only saved because this goddess swoops in and basically convinces the vengeful spirits, let this one go because they're going to be committing to a woke, progressive, matriarchal rule going
Right.
forward. That'll take care of their past patriarchal sins.
Right.
Right? So let's stave off this pagan vengeance because we are woke now, and we have this enlightened new regime.
No, that is totally spot on. I walked out of that theater laughing and writhing in anger at the same time,
Yeah.
and realizing that as a bald white grandpa, I particularly should be feeling guilty about my own self and my history and my it was a total that that movie could be shown in a class on post-colonial Marxism,
Yep.
and it would resonate in every single respect.
And far more effective than any Marxist ever was, right?
Yeah.
Without a gun, that is, because because it speaks in the language that is tailored not just to little girls' fancies, but to our culture, right? It uses all of the archetypes, right? The beautiful castles,
Yeah.
the I mean, the gorgeous scenery, all these kind of things that are
You're
evoking
right. It is very
sort of
Baroque. I like that. It is Baroque.
yeah, but it's like this Western mythological past it's using all those symbols,
Yeah.
and so it speaks very much to our sense of tradition and our sense of history and our sense of belonging. But then it uses all those cues to support a very revolutionary message. And
Yeah.
so you're getting both those warm fuzzy feelings of a safe return to your mythic center, while at the
Redemption.
same time completely combusting and
Yeah.
destroying that center.
Okay, so again, I agree with all that you're saying here, and I have tried just on the basis of Frozen 2.
Hmm.
I've tried to talk to folks and say, "Hey, are you aware of what Disney movies are trying to do to you and your kids?" And people sort of look at me like, "Okay, Ed, yeah, whatever. Disney movies aren't that big a deal. Find something important to worry about." Do you, Samuel, ever run into that kind of sentiment?
Oh, absolutely. And again, it's the idea that entertainment is escape into fantasy, and people actually resent any any effort to get them to stop suspending their disbelief, because they rely on that experience as a way to get out of the daily grind.
Yeah.
And again, it's key to acknowledge that is a totally valid role for entertainment. It's actually more than escapism. It's actually vital for you to be able to get that kind of perspective on life. It's what allows you to keep going. Again, the Bible is providing the same function. And so if you can shift it from that negative view to like the positive, constructive role of myth in our lives, that you can be inspired by story, you can be inspired by entertainment, you can be inspired by history. All these things are hugely important for us to get out of just putting one foot in front of another and
Yeah.
just trudging forward. And that the key is then, how can we get this entertainment process that we need, right? And that's a big part of our lives, to work for us and to work for our kids, not against us. And so maybe if they're really resistant to the idea, it's going to take a while before they're going to be receptive to my arguments in the book. But doing the kind of things that you discussed, having people over to watch something, asking questions, right? Enjoying the process,
Yeah.
but starting to build that critical consumption just by asking questions, just by having discussions. And there doesn't need to be consensus initially. It just is the beginning of a process of of taking control, right? That Second Corinthians 10:5, the to take all thoughts captive.
Yeah.
And again, that's a very difficult hurdle for most people, because they view that as intellectual work, and it is in a sense, but it's also very natural work that once you start doing it, it comes very easily, and it's actually energizing. So yeah, coming at it from a positive perspective, giving them opportunities to consume entertainment in an environment that is conducive to critical consumption, is going to be a really good way to get people past that hump,
That's
especially
excellent.
if they're resistant to intellectual debate. Um,
Yeah. Because this
yeah.
is an opportunity for parents. I mean, it's one thing you can put a movie in, turn it on, and go do the dishes or whatever. It's another thing to sit there and watch the movie with the kid and ask little questions as you go along and say, is that was that really good? Was that a lie? Um,
Hmm.
has the movie said anything to you about God? Has the movie said anything to you about Jesus? Not that every movie needs to, but I think to ask questions like that may get people looking at it a bit differently.
Yeah, and especially too in movies like Frozen 2, um, whenever they use a archetype and then demonize it, like they did in that case with the grandfather, the
Yeah.
character, it's important to then reframe that and say, like, look at your own grandfather, right?
Yeah.
Is that how you feel about them?
Yeah.
What do you think? Um, what do you think that the actual value of those people are? And do you think that these characters, even though the story is painting them in this way, do you think that's really how we should look at the people who are our grandparents and our great grandparents?
Excellent.
And again, just taking people out of the suspension of disbelief, even if it's after the fact, has an enormously important role, because again, it prevents that passive download where the storyteller gets to be God and gets to have direct access to your heart, and
Yeah.
instead gives some pushback, some resistance, so that then it's actually strong. Because then the next time they get that same message, that same flip of the archetype, they're going to have an automatic resistance. Like, no, I like my grandfather,
Yeah.
right? My grandfather is somebody who's fighting for
Yeah.
me, right? And so I'm
Yeah.
going to challenge the storyteller's depiction of that character, because I don't think that is an accurate um, worldview, right? A view of the world.
Right. Outstanding. I'm curious because in my Rebarchekian way of processing things, I read your book as a kind of pants pull on
Mhm.
Disney. Like
Okay.
this, you guys are charming and winsome, and you have great graphics and wonderful music. But really, I'm pulling your pants down to expose the fact that you are working all of us.
Hmm.
Have you had any pushback or any legal threats from Disney for the book?
Oh no, I'm too small time to attract any attention from them. Um, they are they've and again they've successfully resisted a lot of Christian and conservative pushback. If you remember the Baptist boycott in
Yeah.
the 90s, which was again that was directed more towards the parks policies,
Yeah.
um, but they basically just brushed it off and ignored it and refused to take it seriously. So it's a I don't anticipate Disney ever really um, countenancing any Christian or conservative pushback. It's on us. It's on
Yeah.
us to be our own shepherds, to take ownership of our role as consumers. And again, Disney will or will not continue. It's not something that's directly in our sphere of influence. It's really much more about how we can use their past products and their current products to strengthen our own faith, and not view them as this benevolent, harmless entertainment entity that we can just trust ourselves and our kids to without
Excellent.
critical thinking.
No, that's really well put. Disney's going to roll on. The machine's going to continue to eat and eat and eat regardless, but it's what we do with it that becomes important.
And that's the great part about. I mean, if you go back to the conceit, right, of Troy versus Greece and the Trojan horse, Troy was not going to lose that battle unless they opened their gates to the offering of their enemy.
Excellent.
And so, if you are vigilant, if you are capable of exercising discernment, then your own defenses will be sufficient. They will be sufficient. And that's why I'm not recommending a boycott either. There are some things that are worth boycotting. There are some things that are worth just not watching at all. Frozen 2 gets so close to it. I mean, it's
Oh,
so aggressive that it's almost worth just passing on. But the your defenses and your kids' defenses are sufficient as long as you engage them. And the key, our role is engaging them. We have to build
yeah.
them. We have to use them. We have to view storytelling as a transformative process. And once you give it that respect, you can navigate it without being consumed. Without the consumer does not have to be consumed.
That's so good. And again, we're talking with Samuel Lively, the author of The Trojan Mouse. You guys, this is a really good book. He takes you through the history of Disney and shows you how the movies progress and shift and change from away from a traditional Christian worldview into again a woke neo-pagan pop psychology worldview. Samuel, where can people get your book?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. You can find me on Facebook. The Trojan Mouse has a Facebook page. I put up Disney dossiers too. So they're these little infographics that'll take you through the good and the bad of some of the biggest Disney movies out there, especially the current ones. So
Brilliant.
you can have some, and I designed those to be used for the kind of discussion group that you talked about. So where you can sit down and you can watch something with eyes open going into it, and then afterwards begin discussing the main threads of that story, good and bad, um, and see how those reinforce or challenge your worldview.
I love it. That's excellent. Well, I hope you all the best with this book. I hope that the book gets you invited to all kinds of church meetings or churches and conferences and places where you can help Christians, the church, turn their brains on and be discerning. I love that word that you use, that exercise some discernment. This because this is just a timely study, and the title's perfect. The Trojan Mouse. Again, parents don't, people don't, youth pastors don't realize that this is being rolled right into their kids' hearts and imagination. And I'm really grateful that you wrote the study you did.
Thanks so much, Ed. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much, Samuel. God bless you.
You too.
All right. Again, the book is The Trojan Mouse: How Disney is Winning the Culture War. You can find it on Amazon. I want to, again, just encourage you, parents, encourage you, thinkers, that this is an opportunity for discernment. We can just turn off all movies, or we can use movies and popular culture as exercises in discernment. Because we here at the Uncensored Unprofessor, we love to turn our beautiful God-given brains on everybody.